Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Inside Track webinar briefing featuring data and trends that will impact the 2024 elections. Today's webinar is being presented by experts from Ipsos's public political polling team. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. We're going to answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time does run short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. So now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our June Ipsos Inside Track webinar. It's great to have you with us. I am joined today by our data journalist, Bernard Mendez, and editorial director, Sarah Feldman. We have a lot of data to share with you today. So we'll jump right in. But as always, this is all public information. It's all available on the Ipsos website. So we certainly encourage you to go check it out for yourselves. You can also always reach out to Bernard, Sarah, and I, and we're certainly happy to answer any questions you may have. Speaking of questions, as Ellen said, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function of the GoToMeeting application at any time to log any questions you may have. And then Sarah, Bernard, and I will save some time at the end of the webinar to answer as many of the questions as possible. If we don't get to your question, we will answer it via email, so long as you've attached your name to it. All right, so what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to go through the main issues facing the American people right now. Then Sarah will talk about some of those issues, the economy, always sort of the top issue, a range of social issues that the country's grappling with, and then particularly some of the recent big news items, the Trump and Hunter Biden verdicts. Both were found guilty of various crimes and misdeeds in recent months, and sort of the impact of that. And then Bernard and I will actually be talking about some of our latest election poll data. We actually just released our first survey of the swing states, which we'll sort of go into at greater depth. And then finally finish with where our forecast is for the November election. So lots and lots of stuff to go through. With that, let's dive into the main issues. So we're seeing the main issue landscape pretty similar to where we were last week. It's pretty clear that the economy and the political extremism are sort of the top issues, basically tied. And then immigration is sort of a second tier issue just behind them, not a dramatic difference, but a statistically significant one. And then the number of other things that are much further down that landscape. And remember, the way we ask this question is we ask people, what's the one thing that is the most important problem to you? So people, it's a select one. The way the question's worded, they see the full list, they select the one. This is different than some other data we're going to show you in a little bit that actually gives people a longer list of items and lets them select multiple things, which gives people the opportunity to sort of say, well, I'm worried about a bunch of things. And when you do that, you actually see the economy, inflation, cost of living is the thing that the most people are worried about. But when you have this sort of select one, what's the key, the one thing that bothers you? This is our landscape: the economy, political extremism, tied for one, immigration sort of in third, not too far behind, and then a number of other things further down that list. And the trend line is sort of showing the sort of staying power of this. We're seeing the political extremism, which was a bigger issue, sort of the clear number one issue a little earlier in this year, sort of sliding. The economy is actually a little bit higher up, immigration is a little bit lower down. And what's actually happening here isn't necessarily that all of a sudden the economy is a bigger issue, people are more worried about it. Instead, what we're seeing is that a number of Republicans are actually migrating from saying immigration is their number one issue, which immigration is very much a Republican issue, to saying the economy is their number one issue. And that's sort of driving up some of this concern with the economy. Independents have always said the economy is sort of their top issue. And then among Democrats, they're kind of split between saying it's either the economy or this political extremism. So what we're seeing is a bit of a migration of Republicans from immigration to the economy as their top issue. Partially, we believe this is driven because coverage of of immigration issues has dropped off in the last 2 months as Trump's legal challenges actually have dominated the news. Also, potentially some of the moves Biden has made recently have sort of defanged some of the criticisms of Biden. So that has also sort of removed it from particularly Republican attacks and Republican talking points, though I do think in the debate on Thursday, we are likely to see Trump bring up immigration a number of times as an attack against Joe Biden. So something to stay tuned for. Then finally, before we go into a deeper dive on the economy with Sarah, we wanted to show this data from our recent national survey. This is a little bit older, from last month, but it does show when we ask people what are their main concerns versus what are they seeing in the news, there is a little bit of a difference. For one, people see more about these topics than they actually listed as something they care the most about. So we can already see for a lot of issues, sort of news coverage may have a little bit of an impact in driving attention. But you can see particularly the things that are further away from the line, that line is sort of essentially the break even of cares and hears about levels. These are the issues that people are hearing much more about than they necessarily care about. Immigration, crime and gun violence, topics that they hear much more about than they necessarily care about. Foreign conflicts is sort of the most over in that, like, hears about but doesn't care about. So it does sort of illustrate the extent to which what we're seeing and hearing in the media may not always necessarily map directly to what Americans are most concerned with, even though there actually is a relatively tight relationship for most of these between sort of the level of coverage and the amount people care about it. Unclear what the causality is. Is it being covered because people care about it? Do people care about it because it's such a focus of the news? It's probably a little bit of both. But we do see sort of this relationship with some things that are a little bit more off that axis. But it is clear that the number one thing that people are concerned about and that they're hearing the most about is inflation and increasing costs. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah Feldman, who's going to dive into some of our latest economic and consumer data. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Chris. Yeah, as Chris said, the economy is the number one issue for Americans right now, so we'll kick off with that. And to do some context setting around that, we have this slide right here looking at our consumer confidence index going all the way back to 2002. And for folks who've been tuning into these Inside Track briefings and have been following the news, the story I'm about to tell is probably pretty familiar. The macroeconomic environment the economy is in right now is pretty positive, very rosy. We see inflation cooling, unemployment remain low, wage growth happening, GDP growth happening. However, consumers remain more lukewarm about the economy and their place in it, and we can see that in our consumer confidence trend when we zero in on the past couple of years. Consumer confidence has been inching up as inflation has cooled, but given the overall macroeconomic environment, we'd expect to see consumer confidence higher. And that downward pressure on consumer confidence, what's muting and softening that number, I think is pretty clear, lingering effects of inflation. And that's what we're really seeing and demonstrating on this slide here. When we look under the consumer confidence index and parse out some of the component parts and questions that make it up, particularly the questions that measure inflation, act as inflation proxies, we can see that Americans are still struggling, don't feel very comfortable making major household purchases. So think things like a major appliance like a refrigerator, or making more everyday purchases like their groceries or toiletries. Comfort with those two very core parts of functioning in this economy and keeping a household running have really plateaued at lower levels than they were at before the pandemic. And I think that demonstrates that while we are seeing that BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, consumer price index come down, inflation cool, the official statistics paint a very positive picture on that front, consumers are not really feeling that fully still. The effects of the acute and very high period of inflation Americans lived through are very much being felt to this day. And that's being a real drag for President Biden, as the economy is the #1 issue and an issue he's not seen as strong on, which I won't get ahead of myself. That's something that Chris and Bernard will talk about later on in the presentation. But moving on to some of the other social issues, other issues that are percolating in the news right now. Here we're looking at our Axios Ipsos American Health Index, something we've been running with Axios since February 2023. And we can see here that when we ask Americans what their #1 threat to public health is at the moment, that opioids and fentanyl are the top one. 1 in 4 Americans cite this as the #1 threat to American public health, followed by obesity and mental health issues. Now, what's interesting is that these issues like obesity, like opioids and fentanyl, are kind of a steady state concern with the public. However, there are issues that really rise and fall based on what's happening in the news and in the world. And access to guns or firearms is a great example of that. We can see that back in May 2023, that issue really spiked in concern and in importance for Americans as mass shootings, gun violence was percolating in the news, that receded as a worry as that issue receded from the news cycle. And I think that demonstrates a really crucial point that Chris was talking about at the top, which is how news consumption and what's happening in the media and in the world at large really go on to frame and ripple out into the concerns people have. So they're interacting with them in really important ways. And that climate change and reproductive health is another area where we kind of see some of that interplay happening as well. So here we're looking at some key public health news, particularly around reproductive health and climate. And we can see here that most Americans aren't really familiar or don't really know a lot about major developments in these spaces. So for example, like Florida enacting a 6-week abortion ban that went into effect earlier this spring, or April 2024 being recorded as the 11th straight warmest month on record for the planet. So these are issues that when we ask Americans, they're not really familiar with, they don't know that much about, but after hearing more, they do care about these issues. They report caring about them at higher levels. And what that tells me is that these issues really function and can be an activating tool in an election cycle where there's a lot of volatility, a lot of things can change, and a news cycle can change too. And so as these issues are touched on or potentially covered or pressed on by a campaign, that these can be important dynamics and kind of shift the landscape even as the economy is the #1 issue. These tertiary issues like reproductive health or climate can still be relevant debate depending on how they're activated by campaigns or a news cycle. So an important dynamic to watch as we get further into an election cycle. Now, to ground kind of this conversation about some of these, social issues like reproductive health and climate, I think it's worth noting that when we zoom out and look at the past 50 to 30 years or so, that Americans are really growing more tolerant across many different social issues. That's not necessarily being played out at the state or national level in policies that are being enacted, but on the whole, on the top line level, over time, Americans have become more tolerant. Now, I do want to caveat that we are seeing some backlash, and I think this slide from our Ipsos LGBT+ trended survey we released earlier this month demonstrates and acts as an effective proxy for some of that backlash we're picking up in the data. So here we're looking at support for same-sex couples being allowed to marry legally, and we can see that support in the US hit a high water mark in 2021 and has softened somewhat since. And while there's still a majority support, a bare majority of support from Americans around support for same-sex marriage, there is some softening and some backlash. I think is certainly could be tied to the political environment and kind of backlash we're seeing from political organizations and groups overall. So again, important kind of trends to keep in mind as we move through the election cycle and year. Now, moving on to, as Chris mentioned, some big news that broke over the past month or so since we last spoke. The Trump and Hunter Biden verdicts, both ruled guilty. When we ask Americans about whether they've heard about these cases, the majorities of Americans have heard about these cases and the verdicts surrounding them. More have heard about Trump's guilty verdict in the New York hush money case, his center status as a major party candidate and former president, and just his savant as a media attention magnet, I think speaks to some of those numbers we're seeing there. And even on Hunter Biden's legal cases too, we do see 3 in 5 Americans being aware of these things and having heard about the charges against him. So majorities demonstrating some awareness around that, to go back to that news consumption point. But there are some differences when we look at the former president and the current president's son. Now, drilling into the case against Trump for a moment, the hush money case, when we ask Americans in our ABC News polling whether they think the verdict was correct and whether Trump should suspend his presidential campaign as a result of it, we see that about half of Americans feel that the guilty verdict, was correct and that Trump should suspend his campaign. The rest of the public is really divided between not knowing what to make of this, or feeling that the verdict was incorrect and that he should not suspend his campaign. So some mixed opinion there, though half feeling that the verdict was decided correctly and that Trump should suspend his campaign. Now, taking a step back, this has been a long road, a historic moment we've all lived through, with a former president being ruled and convicted as a felon. However, the more things change, the more they stay the same, it seems, with public opinion polling right now. We do see that there's a lot of stability in the data when we look back to when we first asked some of these questions when the indictment was announced in late March 2023. There's been about a 7-point uptick in the number of Americans who feel that Trump should suspend his campaign. However, views on Trump, the impression the public has of Trump, is practically statistically unmoved between March 2023 and today with a guilty verdict. So these impressions of Trump, the public's opinions of him, are incredibly baked in. He's really a known figure for Americans, and even these big sweeping historic events don't move the public on a top line level overall. Now, while I say this, there is some movement when we look under the hood and look at some of the sub-demographics that are underpinning some of these trends. So particularly here, when we examine and ask about people's trust in the legal system, and particularly for citizens serving on a jury, we can see that Americans, there's largely stability on this front, with a majority of Americans feeling that they can trust citizens serving on a jury. So that's softened somewhat since July 2023. But we can see that Democrats and Republicans have been moving in drastically different directions, with more Democrats feeling that they can trust citizens on a jury and far fewer Republicans feeling that they can do the same. So this large legal case and news coverage and polarization of the Trump trials has really swayed people's opinion, rippled out into how they feel about the criminal justice system overall and the machinations of government, which will be an important thing to watch as we see whether these opinions become more entrenched or change over time. Now, on that question of the political motivation and in underpinning fairness of these trials, we can see that there is a large partisan response depending on who we ask and what we're asking about. Asking Americans whether the indictment of Donald Trump was politically motivated produces a roughly 60-point spread between Republicans and Democrats. So a very, stark partisan difference and stark partisan reality between Democrats and Republicans in whether these charges were, politically motivated and legitimate. For Hunter Biden, President Joe Biden's son, and the criminal case against him, we do see that partisan effect too, with twice as many Democrats than Republicans feeling that these charges were politically motivated, but we're not quite seeing the same sway and spread of difference between Democrats and Republicans on this question. So I think that goes back to what I was mentioning at the top of just how polarized in the news coverage and focus that is really the Trump trials have engendered with the public. With that, I think the big question on people's minds that I'm sure you're asking yourself right now is, what does that all mean for the election come November? And what we can see right now in the kind of immediate aftermath of the Trump trial guilty verdict is that partisans have really doubled down in each of their corners Democrats saying they're less likely to support Trump, Republicans saying they're more likely to support him. However, on the margins, on the edge, we do see more independents feeling that they're less likely to support Trump, given the guilty conviction coming from the Manhattan DA's office. So that, I think, speaks to how there can be a top line stability, but under the hood, there are these edges that really can make a big difference when we're thinking and talking about an election that's decided by a few thousand people in key swing states. So that's the state of play right now. We'll see if that continues and if these opinions hold as we get closer to November. And to just underscore that point a little bit more, we do see at the top line level, most Americans not feeling that Hunter Biden's legal troubles will impact their vote for Biden, and most Americans not feeling that the verdict in the Trump trial case is going to impact their vote for Trump. Now, we do see some more Americans saying they're more likely to change their decision, a 16-point difference between the Hunter Biden case and the Trump case. However, again, at that top line level, most Americans have very baked in opinions about these two candidates and feel they know them, and it's hard to have news sway their opinions of them. Though, again, at the margins with such a tight election is where we'll have to really watch to see if these cases change anything in the weeks and months ahead. And with that, I will kick it over to Chris and Bernard, who will walk through some of our great swing state and national election polling. Over to you both.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So Bernard will be talking about our latest polling from the swing states, but before he does that, I just wanted to introduce a little bit why we care so much about the swing states. I think for some of you, this is probably information that you already know, but the focus on the swing states really is because these are states that are pretty closely divided between Democrats and Republicans, and with the sort of structure of how American elections work with the Electoral College, it means that these states, of which there's about 7, probably are going to be the place that decides which way the election goes, assuming all of the other states sort of behave the way that they've behaved in the past. So indeed, we're showing on the screen right now a map of the country showing a distribution of how the states voted in 2020, the last presidential election, and the states that Biden won by 5 percentage points or more in 2020 with how electoral votes are apportioned right now is worth about 226 electoral college votes. The states Trump won by 5 percentage points or more, plus Florida, is worth about 219 electoral college votes. And with 538 total votes, you need 270 to win. So if you sort of do the math, you see that there are neither candidate has sort of a lock on those 270 votes you need to win. So there's about 93 electoral college votes in these swing states that are closely divided, up for grabs. And the reason that these swing states are so interesting from an electoral perspective is because they're so closely divided. So again, looking back to 2020, Joe Biden won the national popular vote by 4.5 percentage points. But in these 7 states, he won by only 0.7%. You can see on the screen, Biden got 49.6% of the vote across these states versus Trump with 48.9% of the vote in these states, the remainder going to people who voted third party or didn't complete the presidential part of their ballot. So you can see these states are already a little bit more conservative, a little bit more Republican or Trump friendly than the nation as a whole. The nation as a whole, of course, is really sort of affected by the huge populations that exist in some of the Democratic stronghold states like California or New York, along sort of the eastern seaboard. And indeed, if you were to take, the population of New York City, it's actually larger than the population of most of those Mountain West states that Trump is winning by relatively large margins. So you can see that Biden runs up huge popular vote margins in places like New York City or LA or San Francisco or Chicago. And then, those sort of votes don't totally get reflected in the electoral college, even though they are in the popular vote. Instead, we have this situation where they are these states that are closely divided, essentially sort of almost 50-50 states that will decide, will likely be the deciding factors for the election. So what Ipsos is going to be doing is we are running a regular series of polls across the swing states. We're going to sort of treat them as an aggregate, as a total, since they almost are break even in 2020, and use that as our guide to what's happening in these sort of key locations, along with the national polling, which we presented to you last month, that we'll sort of be using to talk about sort of what are the big issues that sort of are facing the country and how people are responding to that. And then this deeper dive in these swing states that are probably going to end up becoming the most important thing to focus on for the election. And again, that's assuming sort of all of the other states behave like they have in the past. There is always sort of perennial talk of like, oh, what if Texas swings blue, or what if Florida is gettable for Democrats again? And if any of that happens, it totally sort of changes the calculus. This is sort of assuming that things behave sort of how they have in the past, which honestly isn't necessarily a safe assumption given how crazy the events are for this election cycle. A former president who's been convicted of a felony, never happened before. So lots of potential chaos, but right now things are looking relatively straightforward. And indeed, as Bernard will show in some of these slides, the swing states are actually behaving in something of a predictable fashion. So Bernard, with that, over to you to dive into the data.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I'll get started talking about the data based on our main issue question. So as Chris mentioned before, this is slightly different than the previous main issue question we showed before, because respondents were allowed to select 3 responses as opposed to just 1. As you can see here, inflation really rises to the top of the list of concerns when you allow people to select 3, whereas political extremism kind of fades into like a secondary or third concern when you allow respondents to do so. Suggesting, that although a sizable minority of Americans might be concerned with political extremism, threats to democracy, a lot more Americans are really concerned about inflation or increasing costs. And we see this both at the swing state level and at the national level from our national survey in May. So in the next section, we see that these trends really hold up throughout the region. So when you break the swing states out into the Midwest, Southeast, Southwest, we can see that they're fairly consistent with how they rate the main issues. The Southwestern states are a little more likely to select immigration as a main issue, also political extremism or polarization, but really it's fairly uniform here. But on the next slide, we do see that there is some variability when you break it down by generation and you break it down by ethnicity. So I'll point out a few of the key things to note here. I think Gen Z, their main issue is inflation, as the rest of the demographics shown. Their main issue is also inflation, but Gen Z is also very concerned about housing costs and healthcare, which is interesting because all 3 of these in their top 4 are pretty much measures of cost fundamentally, suggesting that Gen Z is obviously younger. They haven't had as much time to build up wealth as older generations, and as a result are a lot more prone to feeling inflationary pressures, and that is, as we see later, affecting how they view the election and who they plan to vote for. And this also sort of counters the narrative that you might see in the media a lot, being that Biden is struggling among younger Americans because maybe his administration isn't liberal enough, or maybe because of his policy in Gaza. When in reality, foreign conflicts is pretty far down the list of concerns, and what really rises at the top are issues related to cost. Also, I think is important, boomers and white college-educated swing state residents are fairly more concerned with political extremism or polarization compared to the rest of the population. So boomers at 33%, white college-educated Americans at 38%, slightly higher in their concern with political extremism, which we'll see this a bit later, but ultimately affects who they plan to vote for in this election. So on the next slide, I won't spend too much time here, but this is where swing state residents get their information from. As you can see here, it's pretty varied between mainstream media like CNN, MSNBC, or conservative media, or fragmented media, which is basically hundreds and hundreds of websites or local news outlets, as well as that social media, other non-category. We talked a bit about this last month. I won't spend too much time here again, but it's very varied, and it's also pretty similar to at the national level where people get their information. But again, this does ultimately affect how people perceive the issues and who they plan to vote for, which we'll get into a little bit later on. So on the next slide, we see that Biden has a sub 40% approval rating across the swing states. He's sitting at 34% on average across the 7 swing states. It's a bit higher, a bit lower in each of them, although the margin of error is a bit greater, given that there's smaller sample size for each of the 7 states. And he's sitting slightly below where the approval rating is at the national level, which is in our latest core political polling at 37%, so around 3% under. Which is significant because we typically say, based on our analysis of previous global elections, that a 40% approval rating is sort of the tipping point, where candidates with a greater than 40% approval rating have a better than 50-50 chance at re-election, whereas candidates with an under 40% approval rating has worse than a 50-50 chance at re-election. And Biden has been sitting at this high 30% mark nationally for the past couple months, but he's doing a bit worse at the swing state level, suggesting that Biden, if these trends hold up, has less than a 50-50 chance at winning these swing states. So it'll be something worth watching going on, whether Biden's approval rating can improve. The economy is doing good, so candidates with presiding over a good economy have typically seen boosts in their approval rating. We haven't seen that come in for Trump or for Biden just yet, but again, something worth watching going forward. So on the next slide, we'll get into the ballot a bit. As you can see here, it's essentially tied. Biden at 35%, Trump at 37%. I think interestingly, when you look at just the Americans who aren't planning to vote for either Biden or Trump, they tend to prefer Trump slightly more than Biden, which sort of lines up with our previous research showing that these low propensity voters who haven't participated in elections or don't plan to participate in elections tend to prefer Trump, whereas voters who participate in a lot of elections, have voted in 2016, 2020, for example, maybe lean more towards Biden. But when you combine the ballot between these two questions, we do see that Trump has a slight maybe lead over Biden. Again, it's not too far within the margin of error, but on the next slide, we see that it is pretty similar to the national level where things are essentially a tie. It's pretty close, although Chris referenced this earlier, but in the 2020 election, Biden sort of lagged behind, in these swing states, Biden lagged behind Trump by around 3 to 4 percentage points. And that seems to be holding here, where Biden has a negative 3 percentage point margin in the swing states, but it's roughly tied at the national level. So it'll be interesting to watch going forward whether this holds up, and suggest that if things hold up and things are roughly tied at the national level heading into the election, then Trump may have an advantage in these swing states. So on the next slide, we see that Trump does have a bigger margin in the Midwest compared to the Southeast and Southwest, which are roughly tied up for grabs. But we don't break it down by individual state because of sample size. But it is interesting to see, how the different regions shake out. The next slide. I think this slide is pretty interesting, showing that Biden and Trump are pretty much tied across most generational cohorts, which sort of goes against, the conventional wisdom that younger Americans typically vote Democrat, older Americans typically vote Republican. That doesn't exactly seem to be holding true here, potentially suggesting, that as we showed earlier, Gen Z Americans, younger Americans are really feeling this inflationary pressure and are thus more eager to vote for Trump, whereas older Americans who are more concerned about political extremism, polarization, threats to democracy may be looking more towards Biden as they have in previous elections because of their concern with this issue. But on the next slide, we break it down by news, main media source. We see that a similar pattern holds up to the national election, where consumers of mainstream media are more likely to prefer Biden. Consumers of conservative media, Fox News, or social media, or people that don't get their information from anywhere, tend to prefer Trump. Although in this swing state poll, we do see that Biden is sort of lagging behind where he was in the national level among mainstream media consumers, suggesting that this is one area where he's weaker at the national level. compared to the swing state level. The next slide. When you break the ballot down by main issue choice, I think this is pretty interesting. People that are concerned about political extremism or polarization are much more likely to prefer Biden, whereas people that are concerned about inflation or immigration, again, the two of the biggest main issues, as we saw in a previous slide, are much more likely to prefer Trump. Sort of lining up with, Chris will dig into this a bit more, but we're saying that, if the economy remains the top issue for most Americans, that would give an advantage towards Trump. If it leans more towards political extremism or polarization, that might give the advantage towards Biden. So it'll be interesting to watch how the main issue evolves heading into the election. So on the last slide, we see that when it comes to these issues, most Americans actually prefer Trump over Biden on a range of issues, particularly immigration and the economy, which again were the top two issues from this swing state poll. On political extremism or polarization, it's pretty much tied, surprisingly, and Biden has a lead on healthcare. But again, just interesting to see, that Trump is doing pretty good in these swing states, and a large region potentially is because Americans just view him as better on these key issues. But with that, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Chris, who will talk a bit more about our 2024 election and our projections.
Yeah, so a couple more data points from some of our national research before we dive into the forecast. This is from our core tracking poll, our core political tracking poll, Ipsos's monthly survey of presidential job approval, direction of the country, things like that. And we see that in our most recent wave, which is actually coming out tomorrow, technically, so sneak peek. Biden's at 37% approval. This is a little bit better than he was last month when he was at 36, but still not a strong number overall. Still not back to that 40% threshold that Bernard was mentioning. That is sort of our rule of thumb of a incumbent president having sort of a 50-50 chance. We are seeing in sort of the poll aggregators, that is the organizations that sort of pull all the surveys together, create an average. 538 or Real Clear Politics, Biden's numbers are a little bit better. A lot of that is driven by organizations that are using primarily cheaper methodologies to do a lot of research, who are showing Biden's numbers a little bit more favorable than organizations like Ipsos, who are using sort of more rigorous or traditional sort of methodologies that are showing his numbers a little bit weaker. So we are still sort of using our 37% as Biden's number, as his approval number, but we are keeping an eye on what those averages are, because traditionally averages have been a good way to account for the noisiness of any individual survey and have a sense of sort of the broader trends. And the aggregators have shown Biden's numbers improving slightly over the last month, up a percentage point or so, which again, we've not really seen in our polling, but is something to keep paying attention to, because we would expect, like Bernard said, given the economic climate, the lack of any sort of foreign major conflicts that the U.S. is involved in, the lack of any real scandals that the president's involved in, we would expect that his approval rating would improve during the campaign. We haven't seen it yet, but that traditionally is what happens. So we are continuing to watch to see if there are any signs of that starting to emerge. The other thing to just look at in our national data is the horse race. This is different from the national tracking poll Bernard showed, which was the Ipsos's own proprietary data we released last month. This is from a Reuters Ipsos survey that was released just a few weeks ago, showing that the race is basically still tied. I mean, the fundamental story is the same as what Bernard was saying. The race is tied. We actually showed a little bit of a move rather than the 41-39 poll that came out shortly after the Trump verdict. We actually have that flipped, 39 Biden, 41 Trump. And this one, again, statistically tied, statistically at the same, but just showing really that with the American public, with registered voters, the race remains really close. But it's key to remember that there's 20% who are saying that they'd vote RFK Jr., they'd vote other third party, they don't know what they'd vote. And that 20% is well beyond the 2% margin between Trump and Biden. So there's definitely a lot of potential for volatility, a lot of potential for change in what's going to happen with the election. So it's a reason why we're going to stay tuned and keep tracking this for the next 4 months until Election Day. Speaking of election day, our forecast, as always, Ipsos does not do a forecast based on an individual poll. An individual poll can be misleading. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. Instead, we like to triangulate using a number of different sources to build sort of a summary judgment of what we think is going to happen in the future. Right now, first looking at what sort of the other professional forecasters are saying, it's still a little too early to say. Most professional forecasters, particularly the experts who sort of use their own sort of judgment and history, are saying it's still a toss-up. It's too early. It's too close to call, mainly because those swing states, those 7 states we were talking about, too hard to say exactly which way they're going to go. Forecasters who use poll-based models are a little bit more mixed, a little bit more Trump-leaning. The Economist and CNN, which both have somewhat complicated poll-based models, are saying Trump's currently favored. The rest of our poll-based modeled forecasters are saying it's a toss-up, though showing slight advantages for Trump, except for 538, who suggests that Biden actually has the slight advantage once everything is sort of said and done. All of these are using sort of various relatively sophisticated models. It's not just a pure average. They build other factors into it. But again, I think the summary that we should take from this is that at the national level, at least, it's still too early. It's sort of there's too many sort of variables and it's too close to call. So when Ipsos does our own sort of forecasting exercise, like I mentioned, we like to look across a range of factors, and we sort of built some new ones into our chart right now. This looks a little bit different than you may remember. So we've built our own polling in now that we have state level polling as well as our national numbers. We've also taken politics and political extremism off as the main issue. At least for the moment, it looks like the economy continues to be sort of the deciding issue, particularly with independents and unaffiliated voters, the people who might be the swing for this election. They clearly say the economy is the #1 issue. So a couple of things to point out. So in our polling, as Bernard said, we're still seeing the election as essentially a tie, too close to call. It's the Midwest is slightly right at the edge of that statistical tie in Trump's favor, but it's not quite big enough for us to sort of change that sort of coin flip indication. The average of all the polls out there, though, still suggests that Trump's a little bit stronger in the Sun Belt regions, the Southeast and the Southwest, whereas the Midwest, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, I know is not technically Midwest, but we're including it there for ease of discussion, is much closer in general. Some other things that have changed in fundraising. Trump has had a really strong month of fundraising after his verdict. So the advantage Biden had enjoyed on fundraising earlier has basically disappeared. One note, though, of fundraising, when people sort of think about it, both Biden and Trump have had about 1 million individual donors, maybe a little bit less in this cycle. So 2 million donors, basically, between the two of them. That's less than a percentage point of the US population that's actually that's funding these campaigns. Does suggest, to the extent to which that a lot of this is still actually not being driven by huge numbers of Americans. The attention economy, Trump, of course, continues to dominate that. We'll see after the debate on Thursday how that might affect, but Trump has a superpower of controlling the news cycle. And then what the professional forecasters say, and while at the national level, forecasters are still saying it's a toss-up, again, when they look at those Sunbelt states, it is a little bit more Trumpy looking right now. Trump has a bit of an advantage in those states. So all things equal right now, Ipsos's overall call remains that it's a coin flip. It's 50-50, close to 50-50, maybe slightly more Trump, 55-45, all things equal, but very close. And that is because all Biden needs is to get to that 270 electoral college votes, is to win those 3 Midwestern states that are currently close, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. That gets him exactly to 270. So if he's able to win those 3 of the 7, he's able to win the election. Trump could pick up all 4 of the Sun Belt states, and that wouldn't be quite enough unless he picks up something else that Biden won in 2020. So right now we're saying still a coin flip, but very close. Lots of potential for change. So we are going to continue, of course, to keep monitoring this. So looking forward a little bit, Like we mentioned, in a normal political environment, we would expect things to trend in Biden's direction. The macro economy seems to be doing well. Inflation has cooled off. If the country's not involved in any sort of conflicts or anything like that. And traditionally, in circumstances like that, we see an incumbent president get 5 to 8 percentage points improvement in their approval rate, which helps sort of everything else. But we haven't really seen that yet. And we started sort of tracking this in January. It's not really changed much. So we're still very much in this status quo position that probably actually is a best case scenario for Donald Trump. Again, we have to keep monitoring it, see if maybe some of these things that we would expect from historical patterns might engage, but at least at the moment, circumstances are as favorable to Trump as they could be, absent sort of any sort of major black swan style events. The debate that's actually going to happen Thursday night, maybe. This is the first of 2 planned debates with Biden and Trump. It's an opportunity for a lot of Americans potentially to tune in, see for themselves what's going to happen. So that may have an impact. Ipsos is actually doing debate polling with our partners at 5:38 in ABC News. We'll be releasing a pre-debate poll Thursday morning and then a post-debate poll on Friday with 5:38. So you can tune in to watch that to the debate, and then you can tune in on Friday to see that polling, to see what the impact was with other Americans who actually tuned in and watched the debate. And with that, I think we are ready to take questions. So like I mentioned, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A feature of the GoToMeeting application. And then Sarah, Bernard, and I will answer as many of these as we can. All right. Question 1, with only 3% citing it as the most important issue, are Democrats making a mistake by focusing so much on abortion in their campaigns? It's an open question of if abortion is going to help move Democrats past sort of activating their base to being able to persuade a large majority of voters in an environment where, we're expecting 55 to 65% of the country to vote. Abortion is one of those issues that is felt passionately by a number of Americans, and more Americans have opinions about it, but it's not necessarily their dominant issue. I do think, though, that abortion is a key fundraising tool for the Democratic Party. They're able to raise a lot of money off of that, just like Trump has raised a lot of money off of his guilty verdict. So it is actually important for Democrats because this is sort of a multi-level game. It's not just convincing the most voters to show up. It's also getting that funding to run advertising. It's getting your base engaged so that they show up. So I don't necessarily think that abortion is a bad thing for Democrats to run on, because after all, the majority of the country is basically on the same side as the Democratic Party. But it is, I think, an open question of, is abortion something that takes that can be very effective in lower turnout elections? Is that something that's going to translate into a bigger turnout election? We'll see. I do think one of the things that's going to be really interesting, though, is there is an abortion referendum on the ballot in Florida this fall. We have seen that abortion referendums have generally won in the last couple of 2 years since Dobbs, which actually was released just over 2 years ago. The Dobbs decision was released. Abortion referendums have won with about close to 60% of the votes. And it'll be interesting to see in Florida, which is a more Republican state, more Republican leaning state, does that actually help Biden's standing in the state? I'm a little skeptical of his chances of actually winning it, but it could potentially help the Senate race, where Rick Scott, who's a relatively unpopular incumbent, will be running against a new Democratic challenger. We'll see if she's able to benefit from sort of some wind behind her back, because of that ballot initiative may sort of change up things a little bit. So I think it does matter, but I don't know necessarily if it's going to be the deciding factor in the election, which at least right now we believe is the economy, as Sarah and Bernard and I were all talking about. Next question. You indicated there's a strong correlation between Americans' top concerns and news media coverage. How about paid media, aka advertising, social media marketing? Is there an impact between what people see in ads and what Americans think is most important? It's a much looser connection, and it's something that we actually are planning to track a little bit as we get further into the election cycle, to see sort of what impact, if any, advertising actually has on people's views. So for instance, the Biden campaign has launched an ad campaign in the last week or so, 2 weeks maybe, basically just calling Donald Trump a felon, like a convicted felon, like 15 times in the ad. And I think they're just trying to keep that top of mind for people, that people don't sort of forget that Trump is a convicted felon. And we'll see if that matters, right? If that sort of keeps it top of mind for people. Because what we've seen in the past is that when an event happens, you know, a debate or a conviction or anything else, it has an impact in the moment, and then it kind of fades over time because the news media goes on to the next thing that they're going to talk about. They stop talking about it, sort of loses, it isn't as top of mind for people. And I think we'll see if running these ad campaigns may change that. Don't know, we'll have to find out. But at least we have the tools to do that. Next question. Is there a class distinction between college and non-college educated? And is this driving more Black and Latinos to signal more conservative or more likely to be support Trump? Those communities, Black and Latino communities, are also younger, which might also explain why Gen Z leans more conservative. Sarah, Bernard, do one of you want to take that? I know you guys have been digging into that data.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. We had a couple slides about this actually in our last presentation last month. I'm happy to send that along if you're interested in looking a little bit more at that. What we did find when we looked at a national level, Black, Latino responses and opinions, and looked at that within education. So what do Black non-college voters look like? What do Black college educated respondents look like? We can see that like media consumption is there's quite a big difference in media consumption. And going back to kind of the thread we've been weaving throughout this whole presentation, that, you know, non-college Americans overall, and also within the Black and Latino communities, tend to rely more on social media for news consumption as their primary news source, or other non-news sources. And that goes on to influence a lot of the different, you know, views, worries, concerns that are floating around and that are framing their opinions and choices around the election. So I think that is driving kind of a lot of what we're seeing there with the kind of looser support that Biden has among those groups. Much like young people too, as the question asker points out, that younger Americans are also relying more heavily on social media and other news sources, which again is framing and rippling out into their behavior around the election and concerns they hold. So I think that news consumption piece is actually a really big part of that, and can kind of confounding a lot of the different things we're seeing across a number of different subgroups.
Yeah, great, thank you. Next question, regarding the 40% tipping point threshold for an incumbent, is this a national rule of thumb, or might it be different in swing states? Have we looked at comparable state data for previous elections? So the database we use to create this rule of thumb is actually, it's big. We have like 800 different elections in it, and it's actually sort of, it doesn't really, it's not based on any particular geography. So we have states and governors, we have other countries, and, you know, presidents and prime ministers and all sorts of different elections sort of mixed in together into this database. And essentially what comes out of it with all of these different elections and context and everything else is that 40% threshold, that basically an incumbent president or incumbent chief executive really at about 40% is about 50-50 to win re-election. Half the time they win, half the time they lose. As that approval rating gets above 40%, their odds get better. By the time an incumbent president's at about 50%, they're almost a sure thing to win re-election. By the time it gets down to about 30%, it's almost a sure thing that they're going to lose. But really sort of that 40% is kind of that middle of that threshold. And we have seen that it actually is a relatively good proxy or rule of thumb for presidential elections at that state level, because essentially what it's telling us is fundamentally is how popular are these people as in whatever sort of location it is, and sort of what pool of support exists that they can pull from. So, you know, Biden at 35% means that only about 1 in 3 voters in these states think he's doing a good job and can be counted upon to show up and vote for him. And that's not a great number if you sort of think about, you know, the popular, and because we're showing the 1 in 3, you know, people, you know, if Trump gets just slightly more than that, that's enough to win re-election, to win his election. So it's a decent rule of thumb. It's not perfect, of course, and particularly here at this midpoint where it's 50-50, it could go either way. But again, a good rule of thumb. Sarah, Bernard, one of you guys should probably take this one. What indicators, economic indicators like interest rates or whatever, might change people's opinions about Biden's performance on the economy?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, the indicators and their relationship to people's feelings and confidence in the economy we've seen over these past year or two has been really disentangled. So indicators like CPI or unemployment, you know, actually 538 just did a great regression analysis at looking at this, used to be tied really closely to consumer sentiment, consumer confidence. After the pandemic, that's gotten scrambled. And so, you know, I think it's anyone's guess who and what indicators might be predicting and helping Biden and consumer sentiment overall, because those two things have been really disentangled over this period. I think when it comes to policy measures, things like interest rates coming down is certainly a positive thing for things like the housing market or big ticket purchases that Americans are looking to make. However, that is a very small section of the public that is actually influenced by that. And I think what we're seeing here is just some lingering effects from overall like inflation you're seeing at the grocery store, at the gas station, buying your everyday household goods. So, you know, I don't think there's unfortunately, there's not a single indicator I can tell you that's going to say, look at this and we know things will be getting better and Americans will be feeling better. You know, that we've kind of moved out and away from that period as the pandemic has shuffled a lot of things.
Yeah. Saying that though, I think two things, I guess, that, you know, would help Biden is if we saw gas prices come down, which, you know, traditionally we do see gas prices sort of decline in the fall. So that might help him, though again, we haven't seen other sort of historical trends kick into gear. And then food or grocery prices are sort of the other thing that we might need to see come down, because that is sort of where Americans are most frequently exposed to sort of the price of things. And we've seen some scattered reports that there are sort of reductions in costs in some places, but you know, I don't think we're not seeing anything systemic or broad-based about reductions, right? Costs coming down, not inflation sort of plateauing, so costs aren't going up as fast. You know, I think housing is a big issue for Gen Z, but I think interest rates are a little bit divorced from sort of people's understanding of that, and housing's so complicated. It's probably, you know, that's multiple years to sort of undo the mess that the housing market is. So we are at time. I see we have one or two other questions, so we'll get back to your questions via email, but we do appreciate you joining us. Our next Inside Track webinar will be held on July 24th, just about a month from now. So please pencil that into your calendars to join us. In the meantime, we have our ABC News 538 debate poll that we'll be releasing later this week. You can get on our website to check those out, or the 538 website to check that out. Until then, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate having you with us. All of this data is publicly available. This presentation will be shared with you. Hope everyone has a great summer, July 4th, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Thank you so much.